We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Along the coast of Florida, the search goes on for the wreckage of the Space Shuttle. Hello again. Military frogmen in America are getting ready to search the seabed off the coast of Florida to try to find more wreckage from the Space Shuttle Challenger. They're still desperately searching for clues to the explosion which destroyed the shuttle 2 days ago, killing the 7 astronauts. Special equipment will be used to find out if there's anything lying on the ocean floor. Then divers will be sent down to bring it to the surface. So far, the search for wreckage has been on beaches and on the surface of the water. As Newsround space editor Reg Turnhill reports.
60 miles of Florida's sandy beaches are now being searched for clues. Every tide washes up more debris. And this afternoon, the ships and helicopters are bringing in what could be part of Challenger's control panel, with wires attached. Other objects include what's thought to be nose cones from the solid rocket boosters. When the explosion occurred, the boosters went out of control. One looked like crashing onto a town. So the safety officer in flight control punched the destruct button, sending a radio signal to blow them up. Heat-shielding tiles and other objects are being found on the beaches, but NASA is warning people not to touch them. Some may be contaminated by poisonous fuel from Challenger's tanks. All the debris is being taken to an American Air Force base 20 miles south of the Cape, where it's examined by the accident investigators. But some space scientists begin to doubt whether they'll ever find the exact cause of the disaster. One question being asked today is whether the Space Shuttle's cluster really can be safely used for up to 100 flights. This was only Challenger's 10th flight. The brown external fuel tank, which exploded on Tuesday, is the backbone and has to take all the liftoff weight. But recently it's been made much lighter and thinner so that the shuttle can carry heavier cargoes.
Challenger, every detail of the 1 minute 12-second flight is now being pieced together. It's almost certain that the problem lies not with the orbiter itself, but with the main fuel tank and with the fuel lines which connect it to the body of the shuttle. But whatever the cause of the accident, it now seems probable that the whole shuttle program will be delayed for at least a year, and a number of scientific projects planned to be launched from the shuttle in 1986 will suffer. Astro 1, a probe to meet Halley's Comet and due to leave in March, will almost certainly be scrapped. The orbiter Galileo will also be delayed for at least a year. Destined for Jupiter, this had to leave by May to take advantage of a particular alignment of the planets. Galileo was to be the first spacecraft to go into orbit around Jupiter and to drop a probe into the planet's cloud. But US defense projects will be the hardest hit. Star Wars research won't be much affected, but it was planned to launch 2 communication satellites and a new spy satellite before the end of the year. They'll now be looking to unmanned launches like Titan to get the crucial defense equipment into orbit. The European Ariane launcher is fully booked for the next 18 months, so it won't be able to take on any extra load. Which means investigators at NASA are under extreme pressure to find out what happened and to get the 3 remaining shuttles flying again. Conventional radio. But this week, the International Maritime Office has opted for a satellite rescue system, which within 10 years will make the Mayday calls a thing of the past. The first component in the system is a new type of radio beacon. In the event of a disaster, it detects a dangerous level of water and frees itself from the ship. It then transmits a coded signal every 50 seconds, which is picked up by a satellite and relayed to an Earth station. Because they know the exact position of the satellite, they can use the Doppler shift produced in the signal from the beacon to pinpoint its exact position and to alert the rescue services. Its rendezvous with Uranus. It's already over 10 million kilometers beyond the planet, hurtling out further into space. The full implications of the masses of data that the robot spacecraft radioed back to Earth won't be worked out for months. But the discoveries this past week have been dramatic. The 5 outer moons, which had been the merest smudges when viewed by the most powerful telescopes on Earth, could be seen in fantastic detail. Here is the moon aerial, only around 1,000 kilometers across. It has every sort of geological feature known to man. Giant mountains, valleys some 10 miles deep, and channels which seem to have been etched by flowing liquid. Even a number of volcanoes. Those same channels can be clearly seen on Miranda, the closest moon of Uranus. Remember, though, that although the surface looks like rock, it's most probably methane ice. This is Titania, also scarred by massive canyons, thought to be caused either by the powerful gravity of Uranus disrupting the surface, or else some unknown heat source inside the moon. But as well as the 5 known moons, Voyager discovered 10 new ones, 8 of them in orbit outside the barely visible rings of the planet. Now, it's hardly surprising that the new moons haven't been seen, because they're very dark and comparatively small, ranging from 200 down to about 20 kilometers in diameter. This one is less than 150 kilometers across. But while the new moons are dark, the jet black rings reflect about 5% of the light which hits them, even though they're probably made of methane ice, which you'd think was highly reflective. So the blackness was a mystery. What seems to have happened is that the methane molecules in the ring debris seem to have been chemically altered into long-chain organic molecules, rather like tar. So the boulders in the rings and in the new moons may be like large black frozen tar balls. Now finally, even though Voyager flew close by, the planet itself still remained a massive featureless ball of greenish gas. But the heat-sensitive cameras told a different story. They picked up huge ultra-cold cloud masses swirling about across the surface. So what would it be like to stand on the surface of Uranus? First of all, you'd be underneath hundreds of miles of dense swirling clouds of greenish gas. You'd be in a continuous chemical snowstorm, and you'd be crunching across a packed ice cocktail of ammonia and hydrogen sulfide. And the whole thing would be at around minus 213 degrees centigrade. That's a full 140 degrees colder than a bad night in Antarctica. But although the surface is so cold, the discovery of a magnetic field around the planet suggests that beneath the surface there must be a much hotter core, probably of hydrogen. At such enormous pressure, it's behaving like a metal, rotating like a huge dynamo to generate the field. Uniquely in the solar system, the magnetic North Pole is angled at 55 degrees from the geographical North Pole. A bit like having the magnetic North Pole here on Earth, somewhere in Spain. Now, scientists are baffled by this. One of the world's experts told us, I could explain it, but I wouldn't believe my own explanation. Now, while they analyze the results, Voyager 2 has been slung around Uranus by its gravitational field and accelerated further out into space. It's now traveling 4,000 miles an hour faster than it was when it arrived, speeding on to a rendezvous with Neptune in August 1989, after another 3 lonely years of travel. We'll be back rather sooner, next week in fact, so until then, good night.
And what can I get you, sir?
Oh, give me a gin and tonic. No, make that a double. I need it. I just bought my television license. God, 58 quid. I ask you, 58 quid for the privilege of sitting in your own home, watching your own television set. It's diabolical. I mean, what's the BBC ever given us for 58 quid? God.
They make excellent dramas, huh?
What?
They make excellent dramas, huh?
Oh, yeah. All right. And pretty good natural history films. Yeah, but apart from excellent drama and the wonderful natural history programmes, what have the BBC ever given us?
Well, there's some jolly good cricket coverage. And golf.
Athletics. And Wimbledon. And racing.
Sport. And snooker. How could you miss it?
And there's superb news coverage from very early in the morning.
News?
And there's politics, elections, current affairs,
Yeah, true, point taken.
Documentaries?
Yeah, all right, documentaries granted.
Consumer programs?
And series.
Fine, all right, but look, the point is...
Films.
Yeah, but...
And radio, too.
And 1.
And 3.
And 4.
Yeah, all right, I forgot about radio. But...
There's children's telly too.
And science.
All right, fair enough, yeah.
And comedy.
Yeah, there's comedy.
Yeah, that's always a laugh, isn't it?
And there's alternative comedy.
Yeah, all right, fair enough, yeah. All right, there's comedy and alternative comedy, but...
And they did live bait for us.
Oh, they did that, didn't they? Okay, point taken, fair enough. But, be fair, apart from excellent drama, the natural history programmes, the sports coverage, news, current affairs, documentaries, the consumer programmes, series, films, Radio 1, Radio 2, Radio 3, Radio 4, children's television, science, comedy, alternative comedy and music, what have the BBC ever given us?
Well, there's chat shows.
Oh, shut up, Wogan. I mean, there's not even any commercials. Well, except this one.
It could lead to any long-term delays to President Reagan's Star Wars program. And he's called for the building of a new Space Shuttle to replace Challenger, which blew up on Tuesday, killing all 7 on board. NASA officials said tonight that fragments of bone, human tissue and some clothing had been discovered amongst the thousands of bits of debris now being painstakingly recovered. But they said they can't confirm yet whether the remains belong to the dead astronauts.
The American Coast Guards reckon that perhaps 30% of the shuttle will eventually be trawled from Florida's waters. The bone fragments and an instrument panel were found 50 miles from the launch site. Whilst the general public scours the beaches, large quantities of debris are still being recovered at sea.
Yesterday afternoon and into the night, they continue to pick up more debris to the point where now just one ship has 1,000 pounds on it, and all the ships have picked up debris. Also, the pieces they're finding are getting larger. They're finding 10 by 8 foot, 15 by 12 foot pieces.
NASA is meanwhile mowing the grass and preparing the ground for tomorrow's memorial service, whilst the Space Center is already brandishing its faith that other shuttles will go by today moving a new shuttle cargo container into position. And that on Capitol Hill is at the core of the debate. The space disaster struck in the very week that committees here were trying to reduce NASA's budget. This shuttle shell on the move at the Pentagon's new secret shuttle center in Vandenberg, California, is on its way to a brand new launch complex. From next July, a vast array of military and Star Wars-related payloads was due to leave here. But the Challenger disaster has put all that on hold. The multi-billion-dollar military shuttle control center, which we filmed under construction in Colorado last year, is now complete, with nothing to control. Even though there were to have been a record 15 shuttle launches this year, the program was already badly behind. The resurrecting of old unmanned Titan rockets is underway, but it will be 2 years before the heavy lift versions will be able to carry shuttle-type payloads. Building another shuttle would take 5 years and $2 billion. There is no appetite in Congress for such expenditure. So, with the shuttle capacity reduced by 25% by Challenger's loss, analysts say the pure mathematics add up to a serious lack of capacity to fulfill military and Star Wars commitments. Opinion polls taken in the aftermath of the shuttle disaster reveal that more than 70% of Americans still want manned spaceflight to continue. But the sums suggest that in the short term at least, Mr. Reagan's space defense plans have taken a severe blow. Jon Snow, News at 10, Washington.
This was the moment when triumph in space turned into awful tragedy. The death of Challenger and her brave crew stunned the world. What will this mean for the future of man's quest into space? Hello again. Tonight, as people throughout America attend special church services in memory of the 5 men and 2 women who lost their lives on board the Challenger, Newsround Extra will be reporting on how ordinary Americans feel now about manned space flights. We'll be getting the latest information about the search for clues about what went wrong, and finding out how the tragedy will affect space exploration in the near future. In about an hour's time, President Reagan will join many thousands of people at Space Headquarters in Houston for a memorial service for the 7 astronauts. Also in Houston is BBC correspondent Bob Friend, and he'll be sending us a special report later on in the programme. And at Cape Canaveral, where Challenger set off, Tim Sebastian will be telling us the latest on the hunt for the wreckage. And American children living in Britain will be giving their reaction to the tragedy.
It's always worked out okay, and now it just blew up, and it got me real scared, because I mean, what's going to happen in the future? I mean, are they going to stop now, or are they just going to carry on?
And with me here in the studio is our space editor, Reg Turnhill. Reg.
Well, John, my impression is that NASA is getting nearer to solving the mystery of this disaster. At the moment, of course, all shuttle flights are suspended, but the man who hopes to be Britain's first person in space left England today for America. Squadron leader Nigel Wood, on the left, was accompanied by his backup astronaut, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Ferrimond. Squadron leader Wood was due to fly in a shuttle next June, but that now looks unlikely. However, the two Britons will start their rigorous training schedule as planned before next Tuesday's tragedy.
Well, tomorrow, Squadron Leader Wood will be arriving in Houston for his training. Today, though, the city is in mourning. From Houston, Bob Friend reports on the mood of the people as they wait for the memorial service for Challenger's crew.
Within the hour, Mr. Reagan and his wife Nancy will be arriving here in the astronaut city, a city which has been overcome with grief since the shuttle exploded in the sky above Florida. First of all, they'll talk to the relatives of those who perished in America's worst ever space accident. It's an especially difficult time for families, of course. Some are probably wondering whether the sacrifice was justified. But the people of Houston, where astronauts come to train, are sure themselves that the space program should continue, despite this latest setback.
I'm sure there's questions in the minds of those people who are heading up the industry, but I think they feel that they will regroup and go on.
The city itself is in mourning. Cars keep their headlights on as a mark of respect. Restaurants and businesses have put up notices all over town in a tribute to the dead astronauts. But although doubts have been cast over the future of the space program, training is still going on. This is a Saturn V rocket, a symbol of America's desire to conquer space. That's an ambition, of course, which has been fostered by Mr. Reagan. And when he arrives here in Astronaut City, despite the obvious grief, he's likely to encourage astronauts and others to continue their bid to cross new frontiers. For Newsround Extra, this is Bob Friend in Houston.
And there'll be a report from the memorial service for the astronauts on the 6 o'clock news. Well, possibly more than any other space shuttle mission, this one had caught the imagination of the children of America. That's because, for the first time ever, an ordinary person was going into space. Schoolteacher Krista McAuliffe. She was going to give lessons from the shuttle about life in space. Well, school children all over America are mourning her and the other astronauts today. The tragedy has also shocked American children here in Britain, and Roger Finn has been talking to some of them.
At the Hampstead International School in London, half the students are American, and many had been upset. What was your reaction to the space shuttle blowing up?
Well, it was very terrifying. I just jumped, really, in shock.
Well, I was really shocked because, I mean, nothing like that ever happened before.
Horrified. I don't know how to explain it.
Well, I'd just gotten home from school, and I sat down to watch TV, and the news came on, and it said the space shuttle had blown up. And I was just completely shocked. I just stared at the television, and I just couldn't believe it, what was going on. And because I've been watching it ever since, I don't know, a long time ago. And it's always worked out okay. And now it just blew up, and it got me real scared, because I mean, what's going to happen in the future? I mean, are they going to stop now, or are they just going to carry on?
Do you think they should stop?
No, I think they should just find out what went wrong, then just go ahead and try and solve the problem, and then go ahead.
You don't think it's not just too dangerous to keep going on?
It is too dangerous, but
some people sometimes you can have to risk your life just to find out some answers or something like that.
What about you? What do you think about the future of space travel?
I think they should go right along on with what they're doing. I think they should build another space craft and try again. It should continue, but they should have them without the people in them. They should make them that they go up by themselves without human beings in them, because it's very risky for their life.
I think that NASA can learn from their mistakes. Like if they find out what happened, maybe they can perfect it next time.
You don't think that perhaps the space program should come to an end, that perhaps it's all too much of a waste of money?
No, because for the information that's up there, I think it's worth any amount of money to find it out.
The views of some American children here in Britain. And in order to be able to carry out more space missions, scientists first have to find out everything they can about what happened to Challenger. Tim Sebastian's at Cape Canaveral, and he has sent us this report.
Just 3 days have passed since the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded 10 miles from here at Cape Canaveral out over the Atlantic. Since then, scientists here have been working urgently to discover what went wrong. The clues have been coming in rapidly after an urgent search by ships of the US Navy and Coast Guard. Last night, they brought back sections of the side of the spacecraft, just a few of the 6 million separate parts that went into Challenger. Now the scientists have to put their findings together much like a jigsaw puzzle, with information from computers, plus the evidence recovered from the sea. That will all take time.
I feel at this particular time we are putting together pieces of information that will provide for us the answers. However, right now, no, we have no answers.
The astronaut high school is just a few miles from the Space Center, and it's been hit hardest by the disaster. The parents of these children worked on the Space Shuttle project. The day after the explosion, they organized a special collection to help the families of the dead astronauts.
I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. It had become so monotonous, like every few weeks that the shuttle would go off, and you never thought anything would go wrong, and then it happened, and I think everybody was a little frightened and a little shocked.
Americans treat each national crisis as a family affair, and this one is no different. The death of the astronauts touched the entire community living around the Space Center. No one here will forget why the launch pad is empty and why Challenger won't be coming back. Tim Sebastian for Newsround Extra at Cape Canaveral.
Well, Reg, you've been following these space missions for 25 years now. When do you reckon the shuttle will take off again?
If they're getting near to solving the cause of the disaster, which I think they are, then I'd expect it to fly within 6 months. But it'll have to start again, I think, with a test flight, really beginning all over again. And I'd expect the chief astronaut, John Young, and his number 2, Bob Crippen, who did the very first test flight, to do this next flight too.
So they'll be taking the risks, will they?
I would think so, perhaps with one other test pilot on board.
Now, it's not the first tragedy, is it, that's befallen NASA? Almost exactly 19 years ago, Apollo 1 ended in tragedy.
That's right. That was a ground fire, of course, when the Apollo capsule, which was filled with pure oxygen, caught fire because of a spark inside. And there was this dreadful fire inside, and 3 astronauts were burnt to death on the ground.
Well, what did the space scientists learn from that tragedy?
Well, strangely enough, triumph came from that disaster, because everybody looking back now feels that the moon landing wouldn't have worked. NASA wasn't ready for it. The whole program, including Apollo, was rebuilt and reorganized, and out of that disaster came the triumphant moon landing.
So can you see something coming out of this present disaster then as well?
Yes, sadly, I think we're going to see an exact repetition of it. I think morale has been low at NASA. Some of the materials that have been supplied to them haven't really been up to standard lately. I think the whole program will be reorganized, and it'll start again and be much better.
Well, I know that a lot of people and a lot of our viewers will be hoping that someday maybe there's just the faintest chance that they could travel in space. Has this tragedy held that back? that
well,
dream?
Yes, in the short term. I don't think we shall see any more civilians flying for at least a year, perhaps even 2 years. But after that, I think...
Some people have been saying it's been a gimmick, a civilian in space, haven't they?
Yes, I don't agree with that. I think it was perfectly reasonable and proper to start flying ordinary people like Krista McAuliffe. I think it was very proper, and there was no reason to expect this disaster. But there will be lots of flights for civilians in the 1990s.
Reg, thank you very much. And so the space program goes on. The tragedy of Flight 10 of the Challenger was not the end, and it could perhaps lead to a new beginning. America seems determined that men and women should continue to look with their own eyes from up in space down to our Earth below. Bye for now.
Explosion, comparing them with the pioneers of the American West. At a memorial service at Johnson Space Center, Houston, Texas, the nerve center of the American space effort, he promised that the United States would forge ahead with its program despite the loss of 7 star voyagers, as he called them.
The President and his wife greeted the relatives of the 7 men and women Mr. Reagan today called the Challenger heroes, explorers with the spirit of the frontier.
We think back to the pioneers of an earlier century, the sturdy souls who took their families and their belongings and set out into the frontier of the American West. Often they met with terrible hardship. Along the Oregon Trail, you could still see the grave markers of those who fell on the way. But grief only steeled them to the journey ahead. Today, the frontier is space and the boundaries of human knowledge. Sometimes when we reach for the stars, we fall short, but we must pick ourselves up again and press on, despite the pain.
The President promised that the space program would forge ahead.
Man will continue his conquest of space, to reach out for new goals and ever greater achievements. That is the way we shall commemorate our 7 Challenger heroes.
7 children have been left without a father or mother. Millions of children across the nation mourn the teacher they lost. Amongst those gathered to pay their last respects, politicians of both parties. And the children of former President John F. Kennedy. This national outpouring of grief has been compared to that which followed his assassination. But amongst the suffering, there was a message of hope as they all sang America the Beautiful. The search for clues continues. The Coast Guard ship Dallas has brought back wreckage found floating 60 miles off Cape Canaveral. 20-foot pieces of burnt and twisted fuselage. The shuttle's heat-resistant tiles unmistakable on the chunks of metal. And Challenger's nose cone, the rescue hatch the astronauts never got the chance to use, clearly visible on the side. Parts of the cockpit and the wing were also identified. It's hoped they'll help scientists find out whether the giant external fuel tank, the booster rockets, or a leak in a fuel line were to blame. Now, search ships are using sonar devices to pinpoint another large object on the seabed. It could be the pressurized module in which the astronauts rode. NASA have refused to comment out of respect for the families. Back at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, analysts worked through the night, sifting through the mass of computer data, which they hope will eventually yield a clue.
Only a few hours before that memorial service started, Britain's first astronaut left for the United States to begin his training period. Squadron leader Nigel Wood, who comes from Fleet in Hampshire, only briefly acknowledged the reporters who gathered at RAF Bryce Norton to see him off. His backup, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Farrimond, went with him. Squadron leader Wood won't join a mission until June at the earliest.
Good evening. In a brief but moving ceremony, President Reagan has paid tribute to the 7 men and women who died when their space shuttle was blown apart on Tuesday. While he was speaking at the Space Center in Houston, in Florida, experts were finding some of the biggest pieces of wreckage from the spaceship so far. The president said America would forge ahead with a bold but safe space program. But for a few hours today, the attention of the United States was focused not on the wider issues of what had gone wrong with the Challenger, but on the grieving relatives and friends of the dead. Mr. Reagan called them the 7 star voyagers who'd brought pride to a nation. They were Francis Scovey, the flight commander. As a fighter pilot, danger was a familiar companion, the president said. Michael Smith, he said, who'd won enough medals to cover his chest in the Vietnam War. Judith Resnick, Mr. Reagan praised her enthusiasm and professionalism. Ronald McNair, who, he said, wanted to live on a space station one day. Ellison Onizuka, as a child in Hawaii, he dreamed of flying to the moon. Gregory Jarvis, who took his university flag on board, a token for the people who unlocked his future. And Krista McAuliffe, the teacher who the president said carried with her the imagination of the entire nation.
Before the ceremony, the president had met privately with the families of the 7 astronauts. They assured him again of their conviction that the space program should proceed. And to an audience of the entire NASA family, astronauts, scientists and administrators, he pledged to forge ahead with a space program that would be effective, safe, efficient, bold and committed. But his task today was to lead the nation in tribute to its heroes.
Today we promise Dick Scobie and his crew that their dream lives on, that the future they worked so hard to build will become reality. Dick, Mike, Judy, Elle, Ron, Greg and Krista, your families and your country mourn your passing. We bid you goodbye. We will never forget you. For those who knew you well and loved you, the pain will be deep and enduring. A nation, too, will long feel the loss of her 7 sons and daughters, her 7 good friends. We can find consolation only in faith. For we know in our hearts that you who flew so high and so proud now make your home beyond the stars, safe in God's promise of eternal life. May God bless you all and give you comfort in this difficult time.
The service ended with a flypast by the T-38 jets that NASA uses for training and weather reconnaissance. Today, for a more somber purpose, in the missing man formation. One of the astronauts, Ellison Onizuka, was an Air Force colonel. His family were here from Hawaii. As they've done before, after tragedies involving American servicemen, the President and First Lady moved among the families and children as young as the 1-year-old daughter of astronaut Ronald McNair. Later, there were other memorial services, and the period of mourning will extend into next week. But with the shuttle grounded indefinitely, the space agency is already returning to its principal task of finding out what went wrong. This is Martin Bell for the 9 o'clock news in Washington.
At Cape Canaveral, a salvage submarine has found a large metal object on the seabed. It's thought it may be the cabin of the Space Shuttle. Throughout the day, experts from NASA have been examining pieces of wreckage to try to find out what went wrong. Tim Sebastian reports.
The pride of the American space fleet was coming home with only its ironies intact, a rescue hatch that never opened. These are the largest sections of Challenger to be found so far, dredged from the Atlantic off the Florida coastline. A few of the 6 million separate parts that made up the shuttle structure. The rescue work goes on with urgency, a tribute to the spacecraft and the crew who died with it. Fresh news tonight, the Navy's sonar equipment has detected substantial wreckage on the seabed. There's speculation it could come from Challenger's cabin, and divers have gone down to check.
Your families and your country mourn your passing. We bid you goodbye. We will never forget you.
At the Kennedy Space Center, the people who built the shuttle and launched it watched the president's tribute. They were closer to the disaster than the rest of America. For the first time since Tuesday, they were going back to work on the other shuttles, keeping faith, they said, with the 7 who died. This is Tim Sebastian for the 9 o'clock news at Cape Canaveral.
The man who's due to become Britain's first astronaut is on his way to NASA headquarters in America to prepare for a shuttle mission. Squadron leader Nigel Wood on the left flew from RAF Bryce Norton in Oxfordshire with his backup, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Faramond. Neither would talk about the shuttle disaster, although they've sent messages of sympathy to the families of the Challenger crew. Squadron leader Wood, who's married with 2 children, was due to blast off in another shuttle in June to help launch a British military satellite. Now, though, his journey into space is almost certainly going to be delayed. But despite the disaster, his training is going ahead as scheduled in Houston.
Reagan has been leading America's official memorial service for the crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger. The Space Center at Houston became an open-air church as thousands of space industry workers, politicians and diplomats joined relatives of the 6 astronauts and the teacher who died. President Reagan personally comforted the crew's families. He told them the astronauts were our star voyagers, sturdy souls like the pioneers of the Old West. Much larger pieces of the wrecked shuttle have now been recovered from the Atlantic, and tonight a submarine is investigating a very large object on the seabed, which might be the crew compartment.
There's a new theory tonight about what caused the shuttle disaster. A former astronaut says the NASA investigators are concentrating on a possible fault in one of the rocket boosters. Earlier, speculation had focused on a possible rupturing of a fuel line from the huge fuel tank, but newspaper and television reports in America today say a flawed seam in one of the 150-foot boosters is now under suspicion. The investigators are working from computer data. The booster rockets themselves were blown up by mission control just after the explosion because they looked as though they might come down on a built-up area. We have 2 reports. First, today's memorial service.
A makeshift arena on the grass at space headquarters, the families, the engineers and those who have voted the funding, the children of John F. Kennedy whose drive sent Americans to the moon. The event watched across America by as many who had watched the deaths they now mourned. And President and Mrs. Reagan in greys and blacks subdued, here to absorb and coax the emotion towards some kind of resolution. A greeting for Krista McAuliffe's parents who had watched so publicly their instant loss. The teacher's husband and her 2 children at home far away in New Hampshire. The Reagans flanked by the families, the widow of pilot Mike Smith, her grieving lips struggling for composure. Commander Scobie's widow beside Nancy Reagan, images that children who had watched the fated launch now watched on television across the country as the president led the attempt to move on beyond their loss.
We come together today to mourn the loss of 7 brave Americans, to share the grief that we all feel, and perhaps in that sharing to find the strength to bear our sorrow and the courage to look for the seeds of hope. To those they left behind, the mothers, the fathers, the husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, yes, and especially the children. All of America stands beside you in your time of sorrow. We remember Dick Scobie, the commander who spoke the last words we heard from the Space Shuttle Challenger. We remember Michael Smith, who earned enough medals as a combat pilot to cover his chest, including the Navy Distinguished Flying Cross, 3 air medals, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry with Silver Star. We remember Judith Resnick, always smiling, always eager to make a contribution. We remember Ellison Onizuka, who was a child running barefoot through the coffee fields and macadamia groves of Hawaii, dreamed of someday traveling to the moon. We remember Ronald McNair. His dream was to live aboard the space station, performing experiments and playing his saxophone in the weightlessness of space. Well, Ron, We will miss your saxophone, and we will build your space station. We remember Gregory Jarvis. On that ill-fated flight, he was carrying with him a flag of his university in Buffalo, New York. We remember Krista McAuliffe, who captured the imagination of the entire nation. A teacher not just to her students, but to an entire people. On the day of the disaster, our nation held a vigil by our television sets. In one cruel moment, our exhilaration turned to horror. We waited and watched and tried to make sense of what we had seen. Every family member I talked to asked specifically that we continue the program, that is what their departed loved one would want above all else. We will not disappoint them. Man will continue his conquest of space, to reach out for new goals and ever greater achievements. That is the way we shall commemorate our 7 Challenger heroes. We bid you goodbye. We will never forget you.
The memorial service brought to a shattering conclusion by a flypast of astronauts in the missing man formation, one plane peeling off to the heavens. And in the goodbyes for the families, the Reagans expressing emotions that Americans have very publicly yearned to make to the bereaved themselves. Physical support, tears, and a kind of national throat clearing to enable everyone to put the vivid image of the disaster behind them and carry on again. So, as with the bombing of Americans in Beirut, the seizing of American hostages, his own battle with cancer, Ronald Reagan has once again transformed disaster into thoughts of valor and optimism, providing perhaps the clearest insight into the relationship between Ronald Reagan and the heart of America. Jon Snow, News at 10, at the Johnson Space Center in Houston.
This is the nose section of the Challenger, the word rescue still legible alongside a crew compartment window. On the dockside at Port Canaveral, more large pieces were being unloaded during the night. NASA, with little experience of crash investigation, has turned to experts from America's National Transportation Safety Board. They'll begin piecing together the wreckage. Already they have thousands of small pieces and several very large ones, like this section of the aluminium fuselage. There are sections of flaps and a wing section still covered with the heat insulation tiles which protect the shuttle against the searing heat of re-entry and which help this piece remain afloat.
A lot of the material that we've recovered, which is really into the thousands of pounds, is fairly intact, and it hasn't eroded or anything, so they should be able to get a good look at it and try to make some identification.
The search continued, a Coast Guard radio warning of the dangers to intruders into the area.
Extremely dangerous and highly toxic. If sighted, remain upwind of vapor or debris.
And sonar searches have revealed even larger pieces on the seabed. Divers are on their way to try to bring them up. Ken Reese, News at 10 in Washington.
The man chosen to be Britain's first astronaut left as planned today to start training in Houston. Squadron leader Nigel Wood in the White Mac flew from RAF Brize Norton. He was due to go up in the shuttle in June to launch a British military satellite, but the Challenger disaster means it's not now known when Squadron leader Wood will get into space.
The tragedy of Challenger stunned America and shocked the rest of the world. It set back the space program, but President Reagan pledged it will go on. All 7 astronauts on board were killed, including the first civilian to go into space. Krista McAuliffe, a mother of 2, had been selected from hundreds to be the first teacher in space.
Krista, you disappointed? Oh, sure. We're just going to go tomorrow.
This shuttle mission, the 25th, had been dogged with problems for days before the launch. The 7 astronauts posed for the last photo call. the traditional pre-launch breakfast in front of the world's cameras.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. Velocity, 2,257 feet per second. Altitude, 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance, 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go with throttle up. Challenger, go with throttle up. 1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity, 2,900 feet per second. Altitude, 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance, 7 nautical miles.
Krista McAuliffe's parents watched in horror and disbelief as the tragedy happened before their eyes.
Man tries many things, and we advance as a whole human race because we succeed most of the time. We make advances, whether it's in space or engineering or health or medical things. Sometimes, though, we aren't perfect, and then there's a tragedy that brings us back to our own human frailties and our lack of perfection. And so that's the kind of a day we're faced with now. It's been an amazingly successful series of triumphs through the years. But it also is fraught with the possibility of tragedy, and that's what we came up against today.
Space experts from all over the world began studying television replays of the accident. A fuel fault is the most likely cause, but it may be months before the real reason is established.
We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1.
A huge search was mounted by ships and planes for Challenger's wreckage. The shuttle program remains grounded until the cause of the disaster is pinpointed.
Every family member I talked to asked specifically that we continue the program, that is what their departed loved one would want above all else. We will not disappoint them.
The Florida coast with robot cameras to see if they can find what's left of the cabin of the crashed Space Shuttle Challenger. Salvage crews today centered their search 30 miles offshore, where much of the wreckage has been found. Flares were dropped from aircraft to pinpoint debris. 12 ships and 13 aircraft are involved in the search.
Challenger sooner than had at first been thought. Pictures released by the space agency NASA show a flame on one of the booster rockets. And as our science correspondent James Wilkinson reports, this gives further clues as to how the disaster may have happened.
The trouble seemed to start on the right solid rocket booster. 13 seconds before the disaster, flame could be seen shooting from the rocket's side. The flame acted like a blowtorch and led to disruption of the external fuel tank. Each rocket is hollow. Nearly 500 tons of solid fuel line its walls. On ignition, the fuel burns throughout the length of the rocket, generating nearly 3 million pounds of thrust. There are no welds in the rocket casing. Each segment is bolted to the next with nearly 200 steel pins. Apparently, the burning fuel forced its way through one of these seams or through a weak spot in the half-inch thick steel walls. The reusable rockets are designed for 10 flights. Each had done no more than 3. The big external fuel tank began to rupture. Simultaneously, hydrogen leaked from the bottom of the tank and a stream of oxygen vapor from the top. Flames began to engulf the shuttle. 0.03 of a second later, the main tank exploded. The shuttle cabin began to emerge from the fireball before fuel in its nose exploded. From the moment the solid rocket booster began to go wrong, say NASA sources, the astronauts were doomed.
Murdoch.
Pictures released today by NASA have added weight to the theory that a faulty rocket booster caused the explosion that killed 7 astronauts on board the Shuttle Challenger. The new film shows the takeoff from an angle not seen before. In it, a tongue of flame is seen to shoot from the lower side of the right-hand rocket booster 14 seconds before the shuttle exploded. It's thought the flame could have acted as a giant blowtorch, burning into the main fuel tank and then igniting it.
The huge solid fuel booster rockets, which sit each side of Challenger's main fuel tank, are now regarded as holding the key to last week's disaster. They're designed to burn for the first 2 minutes of the flight before they're then released. Now new videotape from NASA shows what appears to be a plume of flame coming from the side of one of Challenger's rockets 14 seconds before the explosion.
At 94%.
The videotape and the still photo frames show an unusual plume on the right-hand SRB, which is under investigation.
Evidence for the so-called blowtorch theory comes from these flashes seen coming from the booster rockets seconds before the explosion. Experts now say the plume may have been flames escaping from a break in the side wall of the booster rocket. This could have played a white-hot flame onto the shuttle's huge external fuel tank, turning its 500,000 gallons of liquid oxygen and hydrogen into a massive bomb. After the explosion, the booster rockets carried on flying, but again, experts now say they can see an unusual exhaust coming from the suspect rocket.
Some kind of a release valve.
Hundreds more pieces of wreckage are being brought ashore by passing fishermen and the official search team. Many of the pieces kept afloat by the heat tiles which coated the underside of Challenger. The largest piece so far, a cone-shaped object said to weigh about 10,000 pounds, was rushed from a Navy ship by helicopter to the investigation team. It's thought to be the nose cone of one of the booster rockets. Ken Rees, ITN, Washington.
Here, dozens of roads in the Midlands and North are closed by snowdrifts. Villages are cut off and thousands of homes have no electricity. One of the
released by the space agency NASA show that a fire started on the shuttle Challenger more than 13 seconds before it exploded. The flame appeared on one of the rocket boosters, and as our science correspondent James Wilkinson reports, this gives more clues to how the disaster could have happened.
The trouble seemed to start on the right solid rocket booster. 13 seconds before the disaster, flame could be seen shooting from the rocket's side. The flame acted like a blowtorch and led to disruption of the external fuel tank. Each rocket is hollow. Nearly 500 tons of solid fuel line its walls. On ignition, the fuel burns throughout the length of the rocket, generating nearly 3 million pounds of thrust. There are no welds in the rocket casing. Each segment is bolted to the next with nearly 200 steel pins. Apparently, the burning fuel forced its way through one of these seams or through a weak spot in the half-inch thick steel walls. The reusable rockets are designed for 10 flights. Each had done no more than 3. The big external fuel tank began to rupture. Simultaneously, hydrogen leaked from the bottom of the tank and a stream of oxygen vapor from the top. Flames began to engulf the shuttle. 0.03 of a second later, the main tank exploded. The shuttle cabin began to emerge from the fireball before fuel in its nose exploded. From the moment the solid rocket booster began to go wrong, say NASA sources, the astronauts were doomed. Flowers from all over the world now decorate the entrance to the Space Center in Houston where the astronauts trained. Their families have said they take comfort from the fact that the whole world mourns with them. And this morning a helicopter dropped a single wreath into the sea beneath where the astronauts perished.
Today revealed flames shooting from the side of the shuttle Challenger 14 seconds before it exploded, adding weight to the theory that a faulty rocket booster was to blame for the disaster. As this model shows, these flames suddenly coming from the lower side of the right-hand rocket booster could have either acted as a giant blowtorch burning into the main fuel tank or ignited the booster's self-destruct mechanism.
The huge solid fuel booster rockets, which sit each side of Challenger's main fuel tank, are now regarded as holding the key to last week's disaster. They're designed to burn for the first 2 minutes of the flight before they're then released. Now new videotape from NASA shows what appears to be a plume of flame coming from the side of one of Challenger's rockets 14 seconds before the explosion.
At 94%.
The videotape and the still photo frames show an unusual plume on the right-hand SRB, which is under investigation.
Evidence for the so-called blowtorch theory comes from these flashes seen coming from the booster rockets seconds before the explosion. Experts now say the plume may have been flames escaping from a break in the side wall of the booster rocket. This could have played a white-hot flame onto the shuttle's huge external fuel tank, turning its 500,000 gallons of liquid oxygen and hydrogen into a massive bomb. After the explosion, the booster rockets carried on flying, but again, experts now say they can see an unusual exhaust coming from the suspect rocket.
Hello, some kind of a release valve.
Hundreds more pieces of wreckage are being brought ashore by passing fishermen and the official search team. Many of the pieces kept afloat by the heat tiles which coated the underside of Challenger. The largest piece so far, a cone-shaped object said to weigh about 10,000 pounds, was rushed from a Navy ship by helicopter to the investigation team. It's thought to be the nose cone of one of the booster rockets. Ken Rees, ITN.
Gave the shuttle disaster. Astronaut Neil Armstrong will head a special commission with the former Secretary of State, Mr. William Rogers. It's now been disclosed that Challenger had booster rocket trouble 3 months before last week's explosion. A NASA report blames inexperienced workers and faulty equipment at the plant where the booster rockets were processed. There's speculation that a leak in one of last Tuesday's rockets might have caused the fuel tank to blow up after takeoff.
It's the right-hand white solid fuel booster rocket that is now the center of NASA's enquiries. The plume of fire spotted above the exhaust fires on the shuttle 15 seconds before last week's disaster is now said by NASA officials to have come from either on or near a joint in the sections that make up the rocket.
The plume appeared right in this area, just above the point where the solid rocket attaches to the expendable tank. And the plume came out on this side, the side away from the shuttle itself.
NASA tracks 4,000 channels of data on a shuttle liftoff, but this time no amount of tracking would have helped. So reliable were the rockets thought to be that the fire sensors aboard that might have fed data to these dishes in Houston had been removed to save weight. But it now seems that NASA knew that there were serious problems with the assembly of the booster rocket before last week's explosion. At the Cape Canaveral assembly plant, where the rockets are put together and tested, last November an accident prompted a NASA investigation. Just 3 weeks ago, that investigation revealed faulty equipment, inexperienced workmanship, and very inadequate safeguards during the assembly of booster rockets. The plant's response is that the rockets which lifted the fated shuttle off the launch pad had already been deployed 3 times without incident. This morning at the Kennedy Space Center, normal duties resumed amid unofficial reports that they hope to blast shuttle number 26 into orbit as early as next June. There is some confidence amongst space officials that they now know where the basic cause of the shuttle's failure lies. And though this was the week in which Mr. Reagan was due to announce major budget cuts in order to battle America's foreign debts, there's confidence that space and defense will now escape with an increase on the heels of the Challenger's loss. Jon Snow, News at 10, Washington.
The pound slipped again today as worries grew about a new oil price war after what was called panic.
And with the rest of the world, they mourned. Christa McAuliffe's school has been deluged with flowers and cards from children around the world. One said, "I wish you a hug." Another, "I'm very sad." There have been worries here about the effect of the disaster on impressionable youngsters. Parents have been taking them to space centers here, hoping that a walk amongst reminders of past space flights will help them to put the ill-fated shuttle behind them.
I just feel like going up there. I wish that people could stay alive. You just gotta keep going, even though that happened. I'd really want to be an astronaut.
We have to keep them and their dreams alive so that they will go up and so they will explore and find out new ways and new things. I think it's worth it.
I think it would be fun to be an astronaut. Make me pretty nervous, but it can happen to anything. It can happen riding in a car or anything. So you shouldn't be that scared.
One child sent a drawing in Christa's memory. It said simply, "Reach for a star."
When the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded last week, killing the 7 astronauts. 28 ships and 13 aircraft are continuing the search for wreckage from the shuttle. 11 tons of debris have already been found. Meanwhile, experts are still studying new NASA film of the launch, which suggests that one of the twin rocket boosters may have been faulty. The rocket boosters, which are the largest solid rockets ever made, fire for 2.5 minutes to provide the push into orbit. Shortly before the explosion, a plume of flame appeared close to a joint near the base of the right-hand booster. Bob Friend reports from Florida.
The new evidence, which appears to show that 15 seconds before the explosion, flame began spewing from one of the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. A wall of flame which could have caused the shuttle's main fuel tank to blow up. Yesterday, the acting head of NASA explained what the film showed.
We've identified a plume coming out of this area of the right solid rocket booster. And in comparing the photography of this ascent with previous ascents, no such plume has been seen before.
After a normal shuttle launch, the solid rocket boosters are jettisoned and parachute back to the ocean. Then they're checked by a NASA engineering team who pay particular attention to the welding points. Some experts believe that it was during the reassembly process that a mistake was made.